Hi, everybody, and welcome to a training on the new Fidelity of Implementation rubric. This rubric is a new resource created for all TCLAS Decision 6 school districts. Here's an overview of what you can expect to learn about in this training. So we'll start first by reviewing the TCLAS Decision 6 grant assurances. Then we'll talk about the purpose of this Fidelity of Implementation rubric. We'll look at the overall structure and some of the requirements, and then we're just going to go through it tab by tab, and we'll also have an example where I will fill out the rubric alongside you. We'll finish up by talking about a timeline of what you can expect this coming semester, as well as some immediate action items. And then at the end, I'll give you some information on where you can direct any questions that you might have. So as a TCLAS Decision 6 district, these are the grant assurances that you adhere to. The first is that you agree to adhere to any statutory requirements for accelerated instruction. In this case, we're talking about House Bill 4545. You also agree to participate in any data collection and reporting to TEA on the efficacy and impact of tutoring programs. And it's this grant assurance that our Fidelity of Implementation rubric was kind of birthed out of. And then the last three grant assurances are more specific to agreeing to cover any additional costs that you might incur via different contracts or paying tutors, that sort of thing. So keeping those grant assurances in mind, and then perhaps also recalling the initial webinar series for TCLAS Decision 6, where district leaders got to explore what the purpose of Decision 6 was and how to equip your campuses to engage with high impact tutoring. We wanted to provide you all with a tool to start evaluating those programs. So we're going to kind of talk about the what and the why. The Fidelity of Implementation rubric serves as a tool for Decision 6 districts to evaluate their high impact tutor program. The tool provides in-time supports to the LEA in two different ways. The first way is that you get immediate access to resources within the rubric catered to some of the challenges that you might be experiencing. And then the second way is that it prepares a more established relationship or connection to your education service center. The key components of the Decision 6 grant, of the Decision 6 rubric include one performance measure that's related to progressing from 4545 minimum requirements to a more best practice approach to tutoring. The second key component or performance measure is maintaining proper training as it relates to high impact tutoring and to your subsidized providers. And then the third performance measure is student growth in academics. This rubric is required for all TCLAS Decision 6 districts. However, your outcomes and ratings from this rubric are not in any way tied to grant compliance or funding amounts. So if you have lower ratings, the purpose is to ground that in self-reflection and figure out some supports and strategic thinking for moving you forward in your program. It's not in any way affiliated to dollar amounts. And then we also wanted to mention that non-TCLAS Decision 6 districts who are also interested in evaluating their tutoring efforts are more than welcome to use this rubric as an optional assessment tool. We'll look now at the overall structure and requirements of the Fidelity of Implementation rubric. Here in a second, when we open it up, you'll notice that there are 8 tabs. The last tab should be hidden to the LEA, but for your purposes, you'll notice that there is an instructions tab that includes an example of what a completed rubric might look like. The second tab is an optional formative tab that provides districts and campuses formative evaluation and guiding questions if those structures are not already set up. The third tab is the summative assessment tab. It is a required portion of this rubric. The fourth tab is a narrative tab. It is also required and it syncs to that summative tab, which will make sense when we view an example here in a couple of slides. And then the last tabs are 3 separate support tabs for each of those performance measures that we talked about earlier. So a support tab for scaling your HIT implementation, a support tab for aligned supports and strategies, and then lastly, a support tab for student outcomes and growth. And then again, that 8th tab will be hidden. All right, so we'll go tab by tab so that you guys can kind of get a preview before we jump into an example. So you can see the 7 viewable tabs at the bottom. Again, the 8th should be hidden to the district. It's just a VLOOKUP. The first tab that you'll see says start here, and it contains some instructions. Notable pieces of the instruction page, just as reminders, please use the zoom feature to figure out what layout works best for you. Some of the tabs do have quite a bit of information that require a bit of scrolling and navigating. And then also in the instructions tab, we note that you should plan to spend between 1 to 2 hours completing the summative and narrative section, really just depending on how many students you're catering to and the size of your district. The second tab you'll see at the bottom is the optional formative tab. And again, this provides some district level and campus level formative questions that can help you gauge your high impact tutoring implementation prior to the summative assessment that is completed twice annually. So we provided this again as an optional tool. Your campuses and district level leaders might already be asking these sorts of questions, but if they're not, this might be something that you want to integrate into your check-ins. Third tab is the summative tool. This is the first required tab. Again, it's broken down into the 3 performance measures and then allows you to read some guiding questions and evaluate your tutor programming on a scale from 1 to 5. And we'll look at this here in just a second. This summative tab links up to the narrative section. And in the narrative section, you'll essentially be able to give us some qualitative data that coincides with the rating that you gave yourself for each performance measure. In this narrative section, you'll be able to talk about areas of celebration, areas of growth, some of your immediate next steps that you have in mind for your tutor programming. And then again, the last 3 tabs will be your additional support tabs. So there's a support tab for scaling high impact tutoring, a support tab for aligned supports and strategies, and a support tab for student outcomes. Each of these support tabs are organized the same, but they provide a different set of resources depending on exactly which piece of the performance measure the district might be struggling with. And again, we'll look at this more closely when we move on to our example. Okay, so let's fill one of these rubrics out so that you guys have a better sense of what you're working with and you know what to expect come fall 2022, where you will be filling one of these out on your own. So once you open and download a copy of this Excel sheet, it's recommended that you open it in Excel and that you do not open it in Google Sheets because some of the formatting may get messed up. But here, again, we see our instructions tab. You'll be able to scroll It reminds you of the purpose. It gives you just an overlook at each of the tabs that you might encounter. And then it gives you a series of 8 instructions that we'll discuss right now. And then it does give you an example at the bottom of what a completed rubric, depending on the scores, might look like, so that you can refer back to this and make sure that you've completed each section accordingly. So after you've spent 5-10 minutes reviewing the instructions, you can make your way over to the formative tool. Remember, this is optional. So later we'll talk about recommendations for this, but we encourage you to at least take a glance, figure out if this is something that is close to what has already been developed at your different campuses, engaging in high impact tutoring. And if not, it might serve you well to begin integrating it. It's broken up by performance measure. So performance measure 1, scaling high impact tutoring. Performance measure 2, aligned supports and strategies. And performance measure 3 is student outcomes. It gives you district level formative questions, and we recommend a monthly cadence to ask these. And then it gives you campus level formative questions, and we recommend a cadence of every 2 weeks. The third tab is the summative tool. This is what is required by all TCLAS Decision 6 districts to submit twice annually. And we'll talk more specifically about those deadlines later on. Again, you can see it's broken down by performance measure. And each performance measure provides you with a series of guiding questions so that you can really understand what we're trying to measure in each performance measure. So we're going to go through these one at a time, and we'll walk through what it looks like to meet the expectation, as well as what can move you towards being an exemplary district, or perhaps you are not quite to the meets expectation. We can describe what that looks like as well. So the first performance measure is scaling high impact tutoring best practices. So right now, we're noticing that most districts are on a spectrum from anywhere from out of compliance with 45-45 all the way to an exemplary district for high impact tutoring. So we know that by statutory requirements, 45-45 provides a minimum set of standards when we're talking about accelerated instruction. High impact tutoring takes us to the next level of best practice for accelerated instruction. In order to meet expectation on this rubric, meaning you would have scored yourself a 3, you want to first make sure that all 45-45 criteria have been met. And what we mean by this is that 30 hours are provided to the qualified students per subject, that tutoring is delivered in a 3-to-1 ratio, or you've obtained waivers, that TCLAS aligned material is being used, and that a tutor is trained on the materials in which they are delivering. In addition to meeting 45-45 minimums, also to score a 3, we want to be meeting high impact tutoring best practices as well. What this looks like is that tutoring is provided at least 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, or it could still be delivered within a subsequent summer program. We also want to look and see that while 45-45 required grade levels may still be the primary focus of your district, meaning you are focused on delivering high impact tutoring to STAR tested subjects, grades 3 through 8, as well as EOCs. But we also want there to be progress towards serving an additional 1 to 3 grade levels outside of those 45-45 requirements. So this is what it takes to get a 3 or to meet expectation. You'll have a chance to view what it looks like to be exceeds or exemplary, as well as if you're still progressing to expectation or if you're in need of improvement. So you'll follow each of these columns. You're welcome to make notes along the way. And then at the very, very end, you're going to use this drop-down menu to select your rating. So let's say that based off of the grade levels I serve and how I'm doing with 45-45 compliance, let's say that I'm still progressing and I give myself a 2. So I'm going to leave my rating here for now, and then I'm going to go to the next performance measure. Remember to zoom in as much or as little as you need to make sure that the formatting is conducive to you. The second performance measure is aligned supports and strategies. The purpose of this performance measure is to make sure that your tutors are trained in the subsidized provider platforms that your campuses might be using, which would be Amplify, BookNook, and or Zearn. We also want to ensure that there are some representatives of the district that have been trained in high impact tutoring best practice. So if we go over to a 3, in order to meet expectation for this rubric category, we would want to make sure that our subsidized provider licenses are being used for part of our high impact tutoring implementation. Now, part is discretionary. You might have one campus, one grade level that's utilizing Amplify, BookNook, or Zearn, and that's okay. You might be a district that has all of their elementary campuses, all of their middle school campuses using Zearn, for example. That's also okay. We also want to ensure if we've scored a 3 on this rubric performance measure, that the LEA has looked into using resources from the VTTC, the Vetted Texas Tutor Corps. This is as needed. So you're not required to enter into any contract with a vendor through the VTTC, but we would expect that district and campus leaders have looked at the Vetted Texas Tutor Corps if they are struggling with staffing needs. That way they're familiar with that resource. We also require that there is local documentation of resources being used in your tutor programming. So for example, we would love documentation on whether or not you've attended scheduling webinars, other agency-led supports, if you've attended any extra ESC workshops that allow you to become familiar with high impact tutoring. Really a great place to start is the Texas Tutoring Supports webpage so that you can get a refresher if you've already seen it, or perhaps you'd be viewing it for the first time. A couple of webinars on high impact tutoring implementation, again, scheduling, how to create programs, how to use the VTTC, that sort of thing. And then in addition to that, we would require that you have accessed and utilized any and all House Bill 4545 resources. Really, this just means that you are familiar with the 4545 FAQ as well as the 4545 implementation plan, and you understand the expectations of accelerated instruction via that new piece of legislation. We also want to ensure that you have some individuals at your district who have attended the high impact tutoring workshop series led by your education service center. This does not mean that every teacher or every tutor must attend, but we would expect perhaps campus leaders or district leaders to sign up for the education service center's high impact tutoring workshop at some point in order to score a 3. And then lastly, we expect that all subsidized provider trainings have been delivered to tutors. And this is going to be by September 30th. So what this means is if you have campuses that are utilizing Amplify, BookNook, and or Zearn, your tutors need to have been trained either directly from the ESC, or perhaps you sent some sort of district level representative to a training who then came back and trained the tutors or teachers on that platform. That's allowable as well. But we would expect that any staff who are using those platforms have been trained by September 30th. And again, some sort of trainer of trainer model is allowable for that. And again, if you scroll to the left, it will show you what a 1 score or a 2 score looks like. And if you scroll to the right, it will show you a 4 and a 5. So it's helpful usually to start in the middle and figure out, do you need to venture down or do you need to venture up in order to find your score? Let's say for this particular one, I am rating myself at a 3. All right, and then I'm going to navigate to the last performance measure, which is student outcomes. The purpose of this performance measure is to tie in the effectiveness of high impact tutor programmings that we have at our district to data that we're getting from STAR and EOC assessment. So this column, or I'm sorry, this row is a little bit different. If you are evaluating in the fall semesters, so fall of 2022, fall of 2023, you will be writing your own student outcomes goal. If you are evaluating in the spring 2023 or in the spring 2024, you will rate yourself 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based on that previous goal that you had written. So if I come over here, there is an additional cell that provides me with an example. So if I am a school district, let's say I'm Apple ISD, I might look at my spring 2022 data to see how many students progressed from did not meets to meet, or to approaches, from approaches to meets, from meets to masters. And let's say out of all the students in my district, 15% of all of my students grew either from did not meets to approaches, approaches to meets, meets to masters. And now I'm going to spend the 22-23 school year implementing high impact tutoring. So I've got to write a new goal. If 15% is what I saw last year without high impact tutoring, let's say that I'm going to strive for 30% of my students. So my fall 2022 outcomes goal that you'll see in this blue cell would be 30% of students receiving high impact tutoring will move from did not meets to approaches, approaches to meets, or meets to masters between my 2022 testing and 2023 testing. So now let's fast forward to the spring. All of my students have tested and I've got my data back, and I'm now ready to complete this rubric in the spring of 2023. Let's say that my data shows that 28% of my students grew from did not meets to approaches, approaches to meets, or meets to masters. I will use my performance measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ratings to determine where that percentage might fall. So if I look in the meets category, it's quite simple. The meets category says that I met my goal. So had I gotten 30% of my students, my goal would have been met. I would have rated a 3. But 28% of my students is what I'm working with. A 2 says that the LEA fell short of their fall 2022 student outcomes goal by less than 10%. Since 28% of our students grew, then I would select a 2 as my student outcomes measure. So I'll go over to the drop down, pretending that this is a spring assessment, not a fall assessment, and I'll select a 2. So now I have self-rated in all 3 of my performance measures. I've selected my ratings over here in column G, a 2, a 3, and a 2. If I move over to the next section, the narrative section, it is going to automatically fill out columns B, and C for me. So you'll notice in column B, all it did was input those ratings for me. So again, a 2, a 3, and a 2. In column C, it's going to give me a series of prompts or instructions on what I should do next. So if I look at my first performance measure, scaling HIT, I got a 2. The instructions tell me that I should view the scaling HIT best practices tab, which is color coded, for more guidance and supports. After I visit the scaling HIT best practices tab, which is color coded, I'm going to use those supports to outline my challenges, my celebrations, and my next steps in my narrative cell. So let's do that. It tells me to visit this tab down here. My scaling HIT best practices tabs allows me to go through a checklist of criteria that I may or may not have met. And if I have not met that criteria, it immediately points me to end-time supports, to resources that are available at an agency level so that I can progress to the next rating the next time that I use this tool, perhaps in the spring of 2023. My next performance measure is aligned supports and strategies. I received a 3, so my box is going to highlight green, meaning there's no additional tab that I need to view. It says that I've reached, or that I should reach out to my ESC if I haven't already, to determine perhaps if there's other trainings or supports that are available for us. And then I'll also want to outline my challenges, my celebrations, and my next steps in the narrative section. Let's say, for example, that I rated myself a 2. This cell would have highlighted blue, meaning I should go to the Aligned Supports and Strategies tab. However, since I met criteria, it highlights green, meaning if I wanted to venture over to that tab, I'm more than welcome to. Otherwise, I'm just focused on filling in my narrative section. My last performance measure is outcomes. I got rated at a 2, so it does highlight purple, meaning I should go to the purple tab to look at additional supports and resources. Once I have done so, I can come back to my narrative section and outline my challenges, my celebrations, and my next steps. Really, the purpose of the narrative section is to make sure that we are looking at the story behind the numbers. Qualitative data has a very important role, and we don't want to disregard that when we're evaluating high impact tutor systems. Additionally, it allows us to find out if we have gaps in resources from our scope so that we can ensure that we're providing you with the best resources possible based on the trends that we see from some of these narrative sections as we start collecting some of this information. So that's our example. I'm going to come back over to our slide deck, and we will take a look at the timeline. Okay. Oh, of course. Let's maybe escape and try that again. All right, well, sorry, I hope you're not getting dizzy. But we just filled out our example, and now we want to look at a timeline. So on August 1st, all of these materials and trainings will be available on the Texas Tutoring Supports webpage. Those materials include a blank copy of the rubric we just looked at. It will also include a Fidelity of Implementation rubric FAQ. It will also include today's slide deck and then a recorded webinar video of this training as well. In early August, your ESCs will be reaching out to TCLAS Decision 6 districts to plan next steps. A lot of ESCs are offering additional training resources and supports geared towards better understanding these rubrics. Some ESCs are also offering to complete the fall 22 rubric alongside their LEA if you require that additional support. In mid-August, TEA is going, to reach out to all of the TCLAS Decision 6 districts, again, with a reminder of these trainings and materials. And then on October 24th, the submission window for the fall 2022 rubric will open, and it will remain open through Friday, November 11th. So that's 3 working weeks that a district has to ensure that they have completed the fall 2022 formative assessment tab and narrative tab in the rubric. So what are your immediate next steps? If you have not already made contact with your Education Service Center High Impact Tutor representative, then we encourage you to do so, although they should be reaching out and instigating that communication as well. Make sure that your district and campus leaders are familiar with the FOI rubric well before the October-November submission. In particular, we would expect that you're working with district and campus leaders to determine if your LEA needs to implement that optional formative assessment piece. Remember, there were guiding questions to ask at a campus level and district level for an additional checkpoint. When you're meeting with your leaders, determine if that resource is something that you guys would like to implement, but it is optional. We would also expect that your LEA would determine if there are any subsidized provider trainings that your teachers or tutors still need to attend. Remember, the expectation is that by September 30th, your teacher tutors or tutors will be trained in the subsidized provider platforms that your campuses are licensed with, Amplified Booknook and or Zern. And then lastly, we would like for you guys to block some time on your calendar as soon as possible because we know schedules fill up and get busy, so that you already have time scheduled with your campus and district leaders during that fall submission window. So finding a couple of hours, perhaps it's in conjunction with your ESC lead. They might be walking you through that first submission, but finding a couple of hours for you guys to come together and look at the fall 2022 submission.